Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to call to order the Housing, Finance, and Policy Committee for March 3rd. It's about 1:10. We do have a quorum. Thank you, members, for coming. We have a packed agenda today, and we will be discussing the overview of rent control and the impact of the region on some changes on rent control. And I'm going to start off with Mayor Carter. If you're ready, thank you very much for coming and coming in person.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Chair Draheim, members of the committee, I want to thank you all for the opportunity to join you today for this very critical discussion about our current housing crisis in Minnesota, which, as you well know, is interrupting every aspect of community life, from education to industry. Our teachers today report students who switch schools a half a dozen times in one school year because that's how often their family switches homes. I've heard from private sector leaders who have shared that even in the midst of a pandemic crisis and a pandemic economy, that the accessibility of affordable housing for their employees is one of their biggest obstacles challenging their business model today. And in St. Paul, we lost 5 people to cold exposure last winter purely because they couldn't find a safe, warm place to sleep. All of these needs have only been exacerbated over these past 2 years as we saw the number of individuals experiencing unsheltered homelessness explode tenfold in the first weeks of the pandemic. As an aside, it must be noted that these are not simply St. Paul, Minneapolis, Twin Cities challenges, but a regional, statewide, and national challenge, as housing insecure residents, workers, and families came from all over the state, all over our region, to seek shelter and refuge in those jurisdictions they believed that they could rely on most for supportive resources. With our population in St. Paul nearing an all-time high, 2 decades of projected growth on the horizon, and an already crisis-level shortage of affordable housing for families at every income level, St. Paul recognizes an urgent need to add a significant number of housing units in our city as quickly as possible. At the same time, with communities of color and renters both now comprising over half of our city's population, and given the persistent disparities we face in housing, education, and economic outcomes that I know everyone in this room is aware of, we also recognize an urgent and pressing need for decisive action to ensure that our housing market is safe, affordable, fair, and equitable for every single family. With the help of American Rescue Plan funding and our partnership with Ramsey County to allocate a combined $74 million to this challenge, we are on pace to add 1,000 deeply affordable housing units for our lowest income neighbors. Still, with a projected need of over 11,000 units, that enormous and historic investment is only a start. As you're aware, voters in St. Paul last November passed a rent stabilization ordinance with the goal of ensuring a local housing market that works well for renters at all income levels. My team and I are working now to iron out the details of implementing that policy, as well as engaging community members to envision suggested improvements to address some of the widely publicized challenges that our current policy creates. One critical aspect of that process is our collaboration with the University of Minnesota's Center for Urban and Regional Affairs to engage a group of 41 diverse stakeholders to provide recommendations that will shape the future of our St. Paul ordinance. Just as our city has proved ourselves capable of crafting a policy to raise the minimum wage with business leaders and union members at the table together, just as we brought police union leaders and Black Lives Matter activists together to chart the path forward on our community first public safety vision, so too do I have confidence that we will prove that renters, workers, landlords, and developers can work together to build a future where all can live with dignity in our city. These meetings are public, and members of our community are welcome and invited to view those stakeholder group meetings, conversations via live stream. While we pursue these goals, we also understand that our shared ambition to keep housing affordable for all is simply not achievable in a city that cannot build new housing units. Just as every other city we can find with rent protection policy in place, provides an exemption to incentivize construction of new housing units, I have proposed that St. Paul do the same. My team has drafted a policy to provide a rolling exemption to this policy for new housing less than 15 years old, and I have urged our city council members to send it to my desk for signature as quickly as possible. This policy would apply just the same for a neighbor building a duplex down the block as it would for a developer building an apartment building downtown. We are encouraged by developers and home builders across our city that passing this policy can help unlock thousands of units envisioned across our city and keep St. Paul's momentum moving forward. Our housing crisis is driven by the simple fact that at every income level we have more people than homes. And our population is growing fast as families across the globe recognize the high quality of life that can be found in St. Paul. Anything we do to slow the production of new units will only exacerbate these challenges. To be clear, there are still critical questions that must be answered. We must determine if 3% is a long-term fixed target or a starting point. We must assess the impact on small local landlords, and we must work together to define a reasonable rate of return to ensure that the policy advances its intended goals. As effective policy can always withstand thoughtful inquiry, these questions do not threaten those of us passionate about the fate of renters in our city. Instead, they reconfirm that effectively helping our neighbors succeed will always take precedence over defending our rhetoric. As our stakeholder group works to hone its recommendations on the universe of variables that still exists around rent stabilization, and as we partner with our city council to advance an exemption for new housing construction, my team remains engaged in working towards the May 1st implementation date included in the ordinance language. City leaders from our Department of Planning and Economic Development, Office of Financial Empowerment, and our city attorney's office are working collaboratively to develop the policies, procedures, systems, and staffing structure necessary to successfully implement this policy. Their immediate focus is on establishing definitions as well as crafting petition processes, monitoring, evaluation, staffing needs, and other operational considerations. By May 1st, we expect to be ready to accept petitions from landlords and tenants alike and to process hearings. While much work remains, we are diligently moving forward. Mr. Chair, members of the committee, the criticality of this moment cannot be overstated. As our low-income renters, working families, landlords, and affordable housing developers all rely upon the same ecosystem and upon one another to thrive, a grand battle that pits these interests against one another can have no winners. That's why our St. Paul strategy centers around bringing each of these stakeholders to the same side of the table. I invite you and every interested party in this room to join me in rejecting the notion of sustained macroeconomic growth and an equitable and inclusive economy as oppositional goals, and to work together in crafting the investments, the public policy, and the resolve we'll need to keep moving forward to continue our work of building a state that truly works for all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mayor Carter. But we really appreciate you coming in, like I said earlier. And before we get into questions, rumor has it there might be a big birthday at your household.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, thank you very much for acknowledging that. It's an honor to acknowledge on the record here that Amila Mayel Carter is 2 years old today. That is a major, based on the number of packages arriving at our house every day, that is a major event. So thank you very much for acknowledging that.
Yeah, you're welcome, and wish her a happy birthday from all of us.
We will.
Members, I'd like to take some questions here, and I know this has been a subject we've talked and debated on for well over a year, and there isn't one silver bullet for our housing crisis that we're in right now with the shortage of units. But I have a lot of questions, so bear with us. But I'm going to go to members first, and then I'll fill in where is needed. So does anybody want to start off? Senator Duckworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Mayor, for being here. I have a tremendous amount of respect for you being here to visit with us. You certainly don't have to be. And I also want to compliment you and others at the City of St. Paul who are endeavoring upon the noble cause of trying to figure out how we deal with the affordability issues in terms of housing across the state, specifically in St. Paul. We in this committee, we talk a lot about it. There might be some differing opinions on how we can go about best solving that situation when it comes to creating more units, for example, which is sort of the premise of my question. Again, you mentioned in your opening remarks that the city of St. Paul has created 1,000 more units. Commend you. That's what we need, more units. That's great. You also referenced that you maybe have about an 11,000 unit shortage. And so finding how we can create more units to alleviate that shortage is incredibly important. And my question centers around the exemption you're now asking for when it comes to the construction of new properties, 15-year-old exemption. So my question is, for you and your staff, have you realized or are some of the second and third order consequences or effects of rent control in St. Paul now becoming more and more clear, and we're realizing that maybe instead of adding additional units, it has the potential to hamper the creation of new units and hence that exemption?
Mayor Carter?
Mr. Chair, Senator Duckworth, thank you very much for the question. I reciprocate your comments, and I very greatly respect all of the members of this committee who work hard to understand and navigate these complex issues on a day-to-day basis. I absolutely agree with you. Some of us come to different conclusions on different days. And one of the things that I commonly share with my constituents is that if you're passionate enough about this, to roll up your sleeves and to get in the fight to make sure that we have a community where people can live with dignity, we're all on the same side, even if we come to different conclusions. Or I use a lot of sports analogies, so I say even if we want to call a different play, we're looking for the same goal. So thank you very much for acknowledging that. We are absolutely digging into some of the potential unintended consequences that could happen. As you know, that is one part of policy making, is identifying the potential, as you said, second and third order consequences that could happen as a result of those policies. We know that there are a significant number of cities across the country and across the world that do have rent stabilization policies in place. We know, I think we know enough that we're able to reject sort of some of the end of days scenarios that we hear from folks, that any rent stabilization at all will sort of bring our economy and our housing market to a crashing halt. And we also know that crafting good, thoughtful policy has to take precedence over anything else in a way that positively impacts the outcomes that I think we all desire. As I mentioned in my opening statements, every city that we can find in our country that has rent stabilization policy in place has that type of exemption to new housing construction for the purpose of addressing the exact type of challenges that you just mentioned. As we read, and I would suggest that it's probably too early to really know what the real consequences are. We've seen a lot of reactions in the public kind of sphere, but as far as the real outcomes, that's something that our team takes very seriously. When we talk about outcomes, that we're talking about not just reactions in the paper or quotes or press conferences, but that we're really talking about individually, independently verified outcome data. And I think it's premature to know what those outcomes are. I think there's a number of things that we can thoughtfully and reasonably predict as potential outcomes, and those are some of the things that we are in place right now seeking to address. As I look at the conversation that we've had around this in the public sphere, a significant number of the concerns that we read about in the newspaper or that we've seen on our evening news have really centered around the question you just described, new housing construction. We believe that we can be a city that can effectively facilitate new housing construction while adding protections and maintaining protections to ensure that families can continue to live and sustain their existing housing with dignity in our city. We don't see those two as oppositional goals.
Senator Duckworth, follow-up?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just to follow up, and I very much appreciate your comments and perspective. And I think you're right. In terms of the long-term impacts, there are probably still several questions or several things that remain to be seen on how this will impact us in the long term. But can you give us a sense of, in the near term and the short term, what you may have experienced in St. Paul as a result of the rent control measure passing? Can you give us a sense of how many major projects have stopped or stalled and how many potential units that's preventing from being created that would help alleviate the issue that we talked about earlier? Thank you.
Thank you. As I shared, Mr. Chair, Senator Duckworth, as I shared in my opening statements, we currently have thousands of units in our city that are envisioned, that we are in direct communication with developers or builders across our city who are looking forward to continue moving those projects forward as we advance an exemption for new housing construction.
I think Senator Rosen has something to that point.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Actually, I had a couple of questions.
Oh, okay.
Thank you so much, Mayor Carter, for being here. It's really good to see you again in person. And I really respect the fact that you are willing to pivot and adjust for your community, for the city. And this is what I'm hearing, and it's very important. I'm going to go to the cost of the implementation of rent control and how much it's going to be for, how much have you budgeted? Have you figured that out? Would it be for law enforcement to enforce rent control? And has that been budgeted for in your city funds?
Mayor?
Mr. Chair, Senator Rosen, thank you for the question. We're working with our city council to figure some of those things out right now. We have, moved forward towards I'll tell you, many of our kind of implementation efforts across the city really center around the goal of setting people up for success, as opposed to the goal, the primary goal of catching people in failure, if you understand what I mean. And so we're working to do that right now. We're envisioning, I believe, a staff of 3 to 4 individuals that we're working with our city council. Will be moving forward with a administrative ordinance to establish that budget in the coming weeks. And thank you for your comments. I appreciate, it's wonderful to see you in person as well.
Yes, for sure. And Mr. Chair?
Follow-up?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mayor Carter. So I think it was in the paper yesterday, Widener Apartment Homes was going to be building over in the old Ford plant. But they've decided not to do that if there's rent control in place. Can you give us any new perspective on that? That's got to be a huge loss for the city. That's such a beautiful area to develop. Are we looking at a new developer? Are they going to be appeased with this new type of ordinance that you're going to be looking at or adjustment?
Mayor
Can you
Carter.
tell us anything about that?
Mr. Chair, Senator Rosen, thank you for the question. There exists a significant amount of opportunity within St. Paul. Our population is growing fast, and anyone who spends time on any real estate website sees just how quickly any home that becomes available in St. Paul becomes quickly taken by someone who sees the opportunity and the incredibly high quality of life that can be found in our community. I continue to hear from home builders and from developers that as we advance a new housing construction exemption, that their energy, their excitement, and their ability to finance projects in St. Paul will absolutely continue. So we are not seeing any of those news stories as permanent losses. We are seeing them as a pause in a really strong momentum that I believe continues to exist in the city and that we'll be able to see move forward. It should be noted that our goal is there are folks in our community who look at that and say, oh, the mayor's doing a favor for developers, or the mayor's doing a favor for builders by advancing this exemption. The real goal is to impact the supply and demand curve that exists for housing in our community. Anyone who's had a introductory economics course knows that a shortage situation drives prices up. So our goal really is to help this policy meet its intended policy goals, which is to ensure that people can live with dignity and affordability, that they can sustain their lives with their families and in their housing in our community. And we believe that advancing such an exemption will both help us maintain our momentum in the city with regard to building both our housing base and our tax base, as well as help us meet the goals of the policy that we're discussing today.
So, Mr. Chair.
Follow-up?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Mayor Carter, would it be fair to say that you are trying to recruit another developer for that site?
We are
Yeah. Go
Mr.
ahead,
Chair,
Mayor.
Senator Rosen, my apologies. As I moved from being on the city council to the mayor's office, I spend less time in spaces like these than I used to, so my apologies for the breach of protocol. We are always looking to recruit developers for any site in our city. We are working very closely with our Housing Redevelopment Authority to ensure that people know what opportunity exists to build, and the developer for the entire Ford site, or the Highland Bridge neighborhood, as we call it now, we are in direct contact with almost consistently. They are represented on the 41-member stakeholder group that I described, and I'm confident, and I'm told by them as well, that as we advance the exemption that we're discussing right now, that our progress on that site and across our city will continue.
Next up, we have Senator Dames, followed by Senator Ford.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mayor, for being here. We certainly do appreciate it. It's good to see you again. Back in mid-February, you announced a 41-member rent stabilization stakeholder group to work on some of the things that were addressed when you passed the ordinance last fall. My question is, would it not have been better to have put this group together before it was put to a vote to find out what some of the circumstances and some of the problems are going to be? And then when it wasn't done then, now I understand you'd like to implement this ordinance by the 1st of May, but yet your work group is going to go through the end of May. So I question, have you changed your opinion on when you want to implement this, or are you going to go ahead and implement it before the work groups has the information back for you to go through and see how that would work with the implementation?
Mayor Carter?
Mr. Chair, Senator Dames, thank you for the question. State law provides that rent stabilization ordinances like the one that we have in place in St. Paul right now must be advanced through a public referendum. Our voters advanced first through a petition process and then through a public election, a general election this past November, advanced a policy into place that included an implementation date of May 1. That is not an implementation date that my team, our city council has made up. It's one that's included in the ordinance language passed by over 30,000 St. Paul voters. That is not something that is up to local control to be able to change that language that was passed by voters. So yes, we are anticipating moving forward with the implementation of that on May 1st. Consistent with the law passed by our voters and consistent with state law, we are anticipating that, being ready to do that. That means we have to be ready for May 1st to begin enforcing and implementing the ordinance as currently drafted, while we work with this large stakeholder group to have a larger ongoing conversation about the long-term outlook for that ordinance. I will say, Senator, I expect that work to be over, never. I expect that work to be ongoing because we need to constantly be able to visit and revisit the need for every single aspect of that policy. My hope is that 5 and 10 years from now, the policies that we need in place are fundamentally different than the policies that we need in place today, because we've had an impact, we've had the desired impact that we want in place. So yes, we will continue that work throughout the course of this year and throughout the foreseeable future. And yes, we are continuing to move forward toward a May 1st implementation date as outlined in the ordinance passed by our voters.
Follow up, Mr. Chair.
Senator Dames.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Mr. Mayor. So when you implement that May 1st, now let's say that your working group that you're have put together, let's say that they come up with some really good ideas that would require some changes. How would you handle that?
Mayor Carter?
Mr. Chair, Senator Dames, we would propose those changes to the City Council. There's a member of the City Council on that stakeholders group, and we expect to move an amendment to the policy through the City Council. Our hope is to be in effect by the end of this year.
Follow up, Mr. Chair.
Senator Dames.
And Mr. Mayor, how drastic a changes can you make before you'd have to take it to the voters?
Mayor Carter?
Mr. Chair, Senator Dames, there has been a strange myth that has existed around this policy that it cannot be adopted. If that was true, It would be the first policy I'm aware of in the history of our country that could not be adopted. Indeed, as we all know, our U.S. Constitution is written for amendment, and so we are moving forward to amend it. The state law says it cannot be repealed within 1 year of passage. I believe there's light, if any, case law on what constitutes an amendment versus an appeal. But again, as we anticipate an amendment effective before the end of this year, that would be beyond the 1 year horizon referenced in state law anyways. And so we are assured that we are on solid ground making amendments to the policy.
Follow up, Mr. Chair.
Senator Dames.
So currently, as I understand, it's a 3% rent control. Is that correct?
Mayor Carter.
Mr. Chair, Senator Dames, that's
If your
accurate.
study group said it'd be better at 4%, can you amend that in city council, or does that have to go back to the voters to change from 3 to 4%?
Mayor Carter.
Mr. Chair, Senator Dames, it's a city law. So it just as the same as this body of legislature can amend any state law in front of it, any amendment that comes before the city council can be passed.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Are you good, Senator Dames?
Yes,
for
I
now?
am.
Okay, thank you. We're going to go to Senator Port next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Nice to see you, Mayor Carter.
Likewise.
Want to congratulate you on moving forward the real investment in housing that you moved through the city of St. Paul, and I'm hopeful that we will be joining you with a statewide investment at this moment as well. But you know, there are a lot of different pieces on the housing spectrum, from those new units that we know we need, but also the naturally occurring affordable housing that exists now, and the concern, a particular concern I have with those deeply affordable units. Can you talk a little bit about how you see the rent stabilization focusing on those two issues that naturally occurring? We're seeing a lot of investment buy-up. We're seeing, you know, both nonprofits, but also private investors, and how you see this helping to keep those affordable and also affecting the deeply affordable, you know, kind of group of housing.
Mayor Carter.
Mr. Chair, Senator Port, thank you for the question. It's very important, and I very much appreciate your sort of preamble about the need for investments in this space. As I alluded to in my opening comments, one of the challenges that our core cities face across our city is this challenge of sort of being a space wherein we allocate a significant amount of resources to supporting families who experience housing insecurity needs. We end up finding ourselves attracting people from across our community and across our entire state from, frankly, other communities that don't have the same magnitude of supports for those families. So the paradox that Minnesota residents end up facing is, what do you do if you find yourself housing insecure in a part of our state that does not provide those types of supports? Well, you move into the Twin Cities, and of course we end up hearing too often a narrative that these are core city problems, when in fact these are statewide challenges that require statewide solutions. There's frankly simply no way for St. Paul and Minneapolis, for Ramsey County and Hennepin County to sustain an entire state of housing needs just within our local tax base challenges. I appreciate you entertaining my aside where that's concerned, but I was very heartened to hear those comments. We are a community. Our state is changing rapidly. As I speak to national audiences about Minnesota, I often tell people whatever your preconceived notions are about Minnesota are probably 100% true 100 years ago, because our population has grown, our demographics have changed, our percentage of renter households in our communities has grown significantly, and our percentage, particularly in St. Paul, of communities of color within our city now represent over half of our citywide population. We know that we as a state have experienced some of the worst disparities, persistent disparities in the nation in housing outcomes, in educational outcomes, in every aspect of economic outcomes. When I was on the city council, I used to tell folks, if you want to see the area that I represent on the city council, just take whatever color-coded map you want, and the place that lights up the darkest, that's the area that I represent. I remember about 15 years ago, as a very young person, running for office for the first time, sharing with someone that I love the things that we're passionate about our state so much. we're a home ownership state, we're an education state, we're a healthy state, we're all of those things. I remember sharing that I love Minnesota so much that I wanted some of it in my neighborhood, and that's why I ran for city council in the first place. A core tenet of this really is to say we have a thriving regional economy, we have a thriving citywide and growing citywide economy, and we have to ensure that there's a place in our city for the folks who work in our city, for the nurses and for the teachers and the educational assistants in our schools and the people who help keep our economy growing, the people who we've relied on very heavily as essential workers over the last couple of years have to have a place to be able to live in our community. We do that not only for them, not only for those workers, for those families and their children, we do that to ensure that our economy can be stable and that our economic ecosystem can be complete with businesses that can find employers locally who can help advance our local economy. So yes, that is absolutely a core goal of this policy. That is one of the reasons I think this policy is critical. And the last thing I'll say with regard to your question is one of the challenges I think we have as we anticipate this policy is we hear from families and from some well-intended landlords in our community that look at that 3% number that we were just talking about and say, well, rent increases higher than 3% are very rare anyways, so why are we doing this? And we're doing this because that's accurate. For some families in our community, rent increases higher than 3% are very, very rare. For some families in our community, rent increases higher than 3% are commonplace. They happen every single year, and that's exactly why we face so many of the challenges we do as a community and as a state. Thank you.
Senator Dietzick.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Carter, Mayor Carter, for being here today. Appreciate it. I kind of want to go on what you were just talking about in that where, the rent above 3%, those increases, for a lot of people, they're rare, but for some people, they happen a lot. We're hearing a lot for the last few years, investors have come in and bought apartment buildings. Now, just your average people are buying apartment buildings, and they are increasing rents. I keep hearing stories of, hundreds of dollars of rent increases. And, that's not sustainable, and many families that just can't do that. So how much of what we're hearing is what I call that rent displacement? I hear that a lot. So how much are you hearing that? And then also, what do you think? I have a lot of questions first, but I'm going to value our time and just stick to the topic. But what do you think we can do to help with rent stabilization and then what I'm calling rent displacement?
Mayor Carter.
Senator, Mr. Chair, Senator, thank you for that important question. I think that's very important. We're hearing a lot about rent displacement. Frankly, we are seeing those trends that you just described, not just with apartment buildings, but with single-family homes, as we're seeing single-family homes purchased, torn down, or built a second unit, the second floor on top of, and sold in this economy right now, in this housing market right now, for rates that are difficult for folks on lower income salaries to be able to afford to live in those communities. Again, I'll remind of all the comments that I just made about the importance of keeping our economic ecosystem whole with those essential workers that we've all relied on. But what I'll say is what we're navigating is really the leftovers that exist in the ability of local governments to make policy in the context of a significant shortage of affordable housing, and I'll be more specific, a significant shortage of affordable housing investments at every level of government. One of the most important things I believe that this body can do, that our legislature, well, two of the most important things I believe that we need are, one, significant investments to help us increase the housing stock that exists across our state. And I will say, listen, I have spent enough time in communities across our state, not just the Twin Cities, to know that Bemidji and Thief River Falls and Rosemount and communities all over our state are experiencing this shortage and are feeling the pain of an incredible, exacerbated shortage of affordable housing. This is not a Twin Cities issue. This is a statewide issue, and especially right now, given the surplus dollars that this body has access to, a significant and meaningful investment in housing units, frankly, at every income level would be helpful. In St. Paul, one of our challenges is sort of the push down effect, whereas families who can afford a market rate unit but can't find a market rate unit end up going into a unit that's affordable at 80% of your immediate income, and that pushes down to create part of the extreme shortage that we see for our lowest income families because there's nowhere to push down from there. That's a challenge. The second piece, so the first piece is those significant investments. The second piece is we know that we have families who are just left behind in our housing market. We have people who have a hard time finding housing because of housing discrimination, because of the type of displacement that you're just talking about, and the type of policy that would help to prevent discrimination against low-income residents, against residents who have returned from incarceration, against residents who have some blemish in their past housing history or their past credit history, or residents who can't afford a security deposit that's 3 or 4 times the monthly rent. Those types of policies in place would help us to keep families stably housed as well.
Thank you. Senator Duckworth, did you have a quick follow-up? I'm not going to give you much time, but.
Very quick, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you.
And thank you, Mr. Mayor. You noted and talked about supply and demand earlier, which is very important that we hone in and figure out what the supply and demand issues are. And we also had a conversation about how this law has paused, or in some instances maybe taken off the table, projects that would create more units or thereby add to the supply, which would help alleviate what we're experiencing as a demand. So as the city of St. Paul rolls this out and implements it, if it proves to be a policy that does more harm than good, is it something that you and the city council are willing to revisit or reconsider as we see how this impacts the housing market specifically in St. Paul?
Mayor Carter?
Mr. Chair, Senator Duckworth, I know I speak on behalf of our city council when I tell you that every single day of every single year, we are willing to consider every policy that we believe will advance the livability and of people in our community. I will share with you, as a person who has a bachelor's degree in business administration, I'm a real believer in those supply and demand laws. We also know that those supply and demand laws, by definition, create winners and losers. With regard to water, the accessibility of clean water in our city, at the beginning of the pandemic, we eliminated water shutoffs. That was important to ensure that in a pandemic, every single family could afford to wash their hands and to follow the type of public health guidance that we are experiencing. I think the conversation that we're having right now centers around the question, we have decided to take educational attainment outside of the supply and demand curve. We have decided to take clean water outside of the supply and demand curve. We have decided as a country and as a community that in the richest country on the planet, there are certain things that we should just see as a human right for people in our communities, that it's not okay for us to see children who switch schools 6 times in one school year because their family is that housing insecure. And as an aside, I'd offer that is an incredible interruption of that student's education. And for all of us who've ever been in a school, when the new kid comes in, we also know that that's an interruption of 6 whole classrooms for every child who's that housing insecure in our community. So all of our goals, our economic goals, our educational goals, our social goals, our cultural goals, our tax-based goals, all of those goals depend on our ability to field a state and communities across our state where people can live sustainably with dignity, with safe, accessible, fair, and equitable housing. And so, yes, you're right. There are challenges to navigate around how this policy impacts the supply and demand curve around housing and housing affordability in our community. And I'm suggesting to you that those questions are all worth the time, energy, and effort it requires to answer them, if that means we can take a meaningful step forward in our city to ensure that families can live with dignity, that children can achieve their true potential, that employers can find workers who have somewhere close by that they can afford to live, and that our entire economic ecosystem can continue to move forward and grow beyond where we are today.
Senator Duckworth, are you good? Thank you. Mayor, I'm going to do kind of rapid fire. We got about 10 more testifiers to get through. But the first thing I wanted to bring up was I got an email from a state employee that thanked us for having this hearing and having this discussion. And she goes on to say that her rent raised 64% since you announced the rent control measure. She was currently paying $1,099, but then with the new rent, which with visiting with the property management company, said they wanted to get the price increase in before rent control came, went to $1,728. So $1,099 to $1,728, and the management was blaming rent control. And that doesn't include the cost of parking that went also up. And my lead into that is your 3% increase annually. What is the definition of rent? So yes, her rent went up almost $700, but her parking also went up. So do you have a definition of what rent is for people that live and rent like I do in St. Paul?
Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. I too live in rental housing in St. Paul, so it's a very relevant question for both of us. To one of the questions that was asked earlier, as a point of process, usually when my office brings a policy forward, it's one that we've spent a significant amount of time, weeks, months, years, studying and figuring out kind of ahead of time the process, that the 41-member process that we're doing right now would usually be done ahead of time. Because this policy did not originate from within the halls of government, this policy originated from within community. Some of those processes are processes that we're doing right now. And again, I would remind you that, as you said, since I said rent control, I didn't say that, our community did, and it passed with over 30,000 votes in our community. That's why we're having this conversation, not because I decided sort of in a bubble that it's a conversation that we should have as a community. I would suggest that the type of increase that you're just describing is one that is brand new for some people in our community over the course of these past couple of months. And given the irony of blaming a rent increase on a rent control policy, we of course all recognize that irony, but I would suggest that that's a type of increase that families across our community have seen before the passage, before 30,000 voters passed this policy back in November. That's the exact type of policy that I think we all listened to that email and that testimony and thought, wow, that's horrible. That's exactly why this policy is in place.
So on the definition of the rent, well, is that defined already, or will that be defined in the working group coming up, the 41-member?
Thank you, Senator. And I apologize, I forgot to answer that portion of your question. That is one of the things that we anticipate working through, that we're actually working through with the City Council right now. The draft that came from community members did not include definitions, so that's one thing that we're having to put in. Our goal, frankly, is to draft definitions that do not make policy, that don't sort of make policy, but sort of advance for now, at least while we wait for the recommendation from that 41-member stakeholder group, what we believe we heard from voters back in November. So I anticipate a amendment that establishes definitions like that critical definition. What is rent in the first place? There are different ways to look at that. Does that include trash pickup? Does it include utilities? Does it include, water, those types of things, or not? That's an important question that we have not answered yet. We cannot wait for a recommendation from the stakeholder group because, to the point that was made earlier, the policy will take effect as drafted in the ordinance language passed by St. Paul voters in November. The policy will take effect by May 1st. So we have to have those definitions in place before May 1st to give both renters and landlords the context they need to be able to find success within our new policy.
Thank you. You had mentioned multiple times about the young family that had their kids go to 6 different schools. And that's awful. I can't imagine what those parents and kids are going through. But we have a lot of housing instability programs out there that we've had for decades. And, help us, and we don't have time today, but maybe in a follow-up, what can we do differently? Because we spend hundreds of millions of dollars on these programs, and obviously they're not working, from stories like yours. So if you can have your staff maybe email us. Not all of that is in our purview here in this committee, but I know everybody on this committee is very dedicated to housing in general. But we have programs. Why aren't they working? So that's one ask I would have. And then as far as you mentioned additional units, and I think in the 5 years I've been here, we have funded housing more than any decade in the history of Minnesota. So I think we realize the importance of the supply and demand issues that we have, being short about 50,000 units today. And that's why we are very concerned about this rent control measure that got put on by the citizens of St. Paul. I'm sorry to blame you on the last comment, but that is exact opposite of what all the economists have said for decades, since way back when I went to college, which I'm quite a bit older than you, but that was one of the poster children, if you will, of examples of supply and demand. Probably the most studied aspect of housing. And I just want to read you one quote, and I'm going to paraphrase just a little bit. This is from Mr. Lindbeck, who's a Swedish economist. In many cases, rent control appears to be the most effective technique presently known to destroy a city, except for bombing. There's example after example that we studied when I was a business administration major back in the 80s, early 90s, of economists that agree that controlling the rent does not work long-term. So when you said you looked at other cities that were successful in rent control measures, what cities are you modeling after when you're moving forward here with your program in St. Paul?
Mr. Chair, thank you for the acknowledgement. One, I will look forward to asking our staff to follow up with yours around some of those greater things that we believe can be effective in helping to lift families and to a successful life. I would appreciate an opportunity to engage personally with any member of this committee on that. When I made those statements, I was very confident that I was preaching to the choir in this space. As an aside, I directed my church choir for 7 years, and I can tell you the choir needs to be preached to some. And so that's why I decided to say it anyways. The question was around supply and demand and economic law. You're assuming you're significantly older than me. I don't know that we know that for a fact.
I am.
But that said, I think we all know from those same courses that our economic principles that you and I sounds like both learned in our micro and macroeconomic classes in undergraduate. Also, when we look at those curves, that bottom left quadrant always represents families who are in poverty, always represents families who are have trouble feeding their children, always represents families who have trouble just making it to the end of the month. As one mentor of mine says, just end up month after month with too much month left at the end of their money. And those graphs that we spent those years in undergraduate studying, those laws that produce the types of quotes that you just described they always leave families, they always leave children in those situations. I did share that there are a significant number of cities across our country that have rent stabilization policies in place and that are still able to effectively build new housing. I am not arguing, Mr. Chair, that there are other cities who have solved the housing crisis that we face, that we can sort of copy and paste a solution from any one of those cities. I am arguing, and I also would not argue that rent stabilization by itself, without some of those other policies and without some of those other investments that we have discussed here today, would solve all of our problems. I am here to argue that our status quo, as you noted, has not worked for our community, that given those investments that you just described and all of the goodwill that exists in this building and in City Hall and everywhere in between, that we are still here having this conversation And that means we have to be willing to have a fundamentally different conversation than what we've had before. I believe that includes policies like the one that we're discussing today. I believe that includes going all in even further on the types of investments that this committee has championed for us. And I believe that means, as we've discussed today, constantly being willing to think and rethink all of the conclusions that we came to yesterday to determine what are the policies, what are the investments, and what shapes the resolve that'll build the best tomorrow for our state.
Thank you, Mayor. And I'm going to move on from there. Members, we have quite a few speakers. I appreciate it. And if you could give us some follow-up on that and keep us abreast of your progress, we would really appreciate it. So thank you once again, and have a good birthday party this
I certainly will. Thank you all for your time.
Next up, members, we have Katie Topinka with the Community Planning and Economic Development Manager for the City of Minneapolis.
Hi, Mr. Chair. I'm joining you virtually. Can you hear me?
I can. I can't see you, but there you are. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Hi, Chair Dreheim and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today and for the opportunity to do it virtually. Again, my name is Katie Topinka. I'm the Policy Research and Outreach Manager for the City of Minneapolis Community Planning and Economic Development Department. I'm going to provide an update on the rent stabilization discussions in the City of Minneapolis. Before I do that, I'm just going to give a little bit of context about renters in Minneapolis, and it's going to sound familiar to many of the things that Mayor Carter just shared. My colleague Fatima Moore is going to be, she is just texting me. She's having trouble sharing, so let me try to do that. I have a presentation here. One moment. Apologies.
Does she have permission? Yeah.
Are you able to see this?
We are. Thank you.
Great, great. Okay. So as I mentioned, I'm just going to provide some context about renters in Minneapolis. Minneapolis is now a majority renter city, with 53% of households being renters. That represents 91,643 households. Almost half of those households pay more than 30% of their income for rent, which is what is considered to be affordable. So we have a growing number of renters who are increasingly paying more than what is considered to be affordable for rent. This slide is a little complex. I'm going to try to explain it very briefly because I know we're short on time, but it shows the changes in household income and cost over time broken down by renters as compared to homeowners. On the left, it's looking from 2000 to 2014. We have that up there just because the recession played a large part in what was happening to incomes and housing costs during that time. As you can see, for homeowners, incomes increased by 11%, while housing costs did not go up in that time period. Whereas for renters, incomes actually went down from 2000 to 2014, and housing costs went up by 11%. The chart on the right shows a comparison between 2000 and 2018 adjusted for inflation. The bit of good news is that incomes for renters did start to go up a little bit over that time period, but not nearly as quickly as housing costs increased. So incomes went up by 8%, while housing costs rose by 25%. And again, the trend looks a lot different for homeowners, where incomes increased by 25% and housing costs by only 5%. This slide shows the breakdown of renters and homeowners by race and ethnicity in the city of Minneapolis. And I just wanted to present it here because, as you can see, white households are the only group for which a majority are homeowners in the city of Minneapolis, at least for those that are represented on this slide. For all others shown here, the majority of households are renters. And so, that the renter population is disproportionately made up of Black, Indigenous, and people of color households in the city of Minneapolis. In this slide, this comes from a study done by the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs, and it looks a little complex, but essentially what it is showing you is that the city is becoming increasingly unaffordable for all renters. The map on the top is the year 2000, the series of maps, and then on the second row, it's the year 2016. The blue on the map are parts of the city that are affordable, broken down by the median income based on race. So for Black households, Hispanic households, Asian and white or non-Latino households. And then it's the same breakdown for 2016. You can see for all racial groups represented here, the city has become less affordable. And for Black or African-American households, for the median renter.
Can I interrupt real quick?
Yes.
Am I reading that right, that it shows that the income from 2000 to 2016 has dropped
Yes.
by $10,000?
Yes, and we can go back, this, as I mentioned, this is done by Kira, and so we can follow up with them to confirm that data for you. But yes, that is the data they
So
presented here.
what I'm looking at is the top left members for Black or African-American, 27,000 a year, and then the bottom is 17,000 for a year. So anyway, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yep.
Go ahead.
No, that's okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Really, the reason I wanted to present this slide today is just to show that the city is, for renters, has become increasingly unaffordable since the year 2000. And so just broadly speaking, the city is undertaking a number of strategies around housing that are really informed by these trends. We are working to increase the supply, to create ownership opportunities, to change policies, to support renters through both policy and investments, and engage in public and private partnerships. And all of these strategies are really aimed at trying to undo the trends that I just shared with you. And so lastly, I'll close just with an update on the rent stabilization discussions in the city of Minneapolis. We are in a different place than the city of St. Paul is because our city charters are a little bit different. So in February of 2021, the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs released a background study on rent stabilization. The city did contract with them, asking them to do that. They conducted a study which looked at market conditions in Minneapolis, reviewed rent stabilization programs or policies in similarly sized cities, and reviewed potential impacts of rent stabilization in Minneapolis. The study did not make any specific policy recommendations. In November of 2021, Minneapolis voters approved a ballot question with 53.21% of the vote. The ballot question did not establish or create a policy, but rather it authorized the council to consider a policy. The city attorney's office has advised and expressed last fall during public deliberations on this that any rent stabilization policy that is authorized by the council will need to go to the voters for approval. Currently, the city council is considering establishing a rent stabilization work group that would make policy recommendations to the council. The group would be made up of external stakeholders who would review peer city policies, review different policy features, and make recommendations. We expect the council to consider a resolution to establish that work group this month, and then selection of membership would begin after the resolution is adopted by the council. So that concludes what I wanted to share with the committee today. I'm happy to take questions now, and also my email address is on the presentation, and feel free to follow up with me afterward as well.
Well, thank you for
Mr.
the
Chair.
presentation. Members, any quick questions? Otherwise, I'd really like to get through some more of the presenters. So if there's nothing, you have anything quick there, Senator Dietz?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll just be really brief because I know we're behind on time. I'd like to thank Mr. Topinka for testifying and for answering the questions. I know that I've had several robust discussions with council members and with my community on how we go forward, and so there are differences in where Minneapolis and St. Paul are in the process. So Appreciate that. I have questions for Ms. Topinka, but I can ask those offline.
Thank you, Senator Dusick. Members, we're gonna go down the list here. First up is Mr. Osmondson, Director of Development for Atlas. Alatis. Please state your name for the record.
Hello, good afternoon, Mr. Chair and committee members and the Housing, Finance, and Policy Committee. My name is Chris Osmondson. I'm the Director of Development with Alatis. You're not the first person to screw up the name, so I totally understand. We're a real estate development firm located in Minneapolis and current focus solely on residential housing and mixed-use development in the Twin Cities and immediately adjacent areas, including Rochester and Olmsted County. As everyone knows here, we're in the midst of one of the largest housing affordability crises in the United States, and the state of Minnesota is no exception. Housing affordability crisis is a result of multiple factors, but certainly not limited to individual and institutional bad actors, stagnating wages along with pervasive income and wealth inequality, and a dated regulatory housing system that has seen few impactful modifications since the adoption of Section 42 and the tax code and the creation of the low-income housing tax credit. As a residential developer, we are often asked to solve some of these complex equations in a public body and with municipal supervision. Today, I'd like to discuss just a little bit about the medium that real estate developers often are working in, some anecdotal and data-based observations based on the proposed and initiated rent control stabilization initiatives in St. Paul and the city of Minneapolis, respectively, and then just a few novel recommendations for a toolbox of continuing to address these affordability and supply issues. While real estate developers often bear the brunt of the criticism and blame for the current position of our housing market, we are generally an intermediary between local, regional, national, and international capital institutions, the communities that we've chosen to work in and or live, and the municipal body that operates within those communities. For a complex development to happen, and the only requirement is that there's a general agreement amongst most of the stakeholders for these real estate development projects, and otherwise they simply don't move forward. The result of increased housing regulation at the local level in the form of rent control or rent stabilization initiatives was anticipated and has generally held on previous studies and bodies of work, as has previously been discussed today. Institutional capital coming into the Twin Cities, which has really only recently begun to flow in more enhanced values, has somewhat all but redlined the city of St. Paul for the time being, and that is, if not directly correlated or caused by the rent control referendum that was enacted in the last election cycle. Advocates for rent control policies will argue that this is simply a bluff by biased actors in the larger body of a residential housing market. But real estate developers have no reason to argue this because we have the ability to work within different political bodies and locations. Similarly, capital partners have the same ability as well. And if they are not able to realize the financial fiduciary duties of their clients, which are often pension funds or retirement accounts, they'll simply look to invest elsewhere to guarantee those income investment goals that they have set for their clients. Simply stated, rent control is a blunt regulatory tool that, while is helpful to a smaller population, it adds a tremendous level of uncertainty and risk to an already extremely capital-intensive process. When non-local actors have the very easy ability to minimize that risk and the capital intensivity by placing investment capital elsewhere, they simply choose to do so. This is already being seen in St. Paul with numerous projects and a substantial amount of already entitled residential for rent housing projects being paused indefinitely. Empirically, we've seen rent control initiatives have resulted in a greater amount of negative externalities or unintended consequences than the amount of mitigated individual or family displacements that these blanket regulatory mandates are designed to prevent. Generally, this is not a good or rational decision-making process with an outcome such as rent control. While there has been a sea change in the resources available to address these massive issues with a general depletion of those resources, there has not been a corresponding restructuring of the underlying foundations that are responsible for creating a working housing market. First, we would like to argue that anything that stifles the free market of housing supply and demand is not in favor of housing production. We have yet to achieve a state of equilibrium in the local housing market, which is seen in both the ownership and rental markets continuing to be out of balance, as is exhibited by constrained supply, increased pricing, and record low vacancy, which existed prior to the pandemic and has now dramatically rebounded post-pandemic. You could argue that our local economy is actually stronger in some respects. Yet the ship has already somewhat sailed, as you've invited me here to discuss pending and all institutional regulatory statutes that are adverse to creating this equilibrium. And to some extent, it could be argued that these regulatory reactions are warranted in order to rein in the excesses that have been created by a somewhat unfettered system. Second, lax regulatory modifications over 35 years since the creation of Section 42 and major changes to the tax code have not kept up with housing dynamics in public and private markets. Previously, public housing authorities were the bodies that were used to support those lowest income residents with a safety net of rightful housing accommodations. Furthermore, Section 8 and housing assistance payment contracts and project-based voucher systems, robustly funded at their outset, also provided a combination of public and private subsidization for the creation of more low-income housing offerings. Public housing authorities in Section 8 in general have seen massive underfunding since their peak of use in the late 1980s and have since languished in almost every aspect of the word. This has dropped the housing safety net and pushed the burden of lower income private development onto the private development sector. Without adequate funding of Section 8 housing initiatives, private developers are left with a patchwork of local regulatory ordinances and Section 42 low-income housing tax credits. The latter of these programs is really designed for the support of what is often called missing middle-income housing, and that is exhibited in its regional income and rental rate assumptions and the very data the program uses to create that outcome. It was not created, nor does it incentivize the creation of low-income housing in the 30% area median income rental and income restriction offerings that are so often in the discourse of affordable housing these days. All of that is to simply state that bluntly, the lowest rung of the housing affordability scale has more or less had the rug pulled out from under it, while increased regulatory scrutiny is beginning to, and severely in some locales, minimize the delivery of even market rate housing product, further curtailing the future of robust stability in the housing market due to housing optionality missing along every sector of the housing spectrum, as Mayor Carter so eloquently put earlier today. Lastly, older market rate housing stock, often owned and operated by local mom and pop organizations, has generally avoided regulatory framework. While this is ideal from an efficiency standpoint and production, it has created opportunities for heavily return-oriented capital institutions to purchase these seemingly undervalued assets and instigate value-add business plans, performing minor cosmetic capital improvements while increasing rents on long-term tenants, often leading to displacements and filtering, as was previously discussed. Lack of reasonable residual or exit methods has led owners and operators of naturally occurring affordable housing to often have no other choice but to capitalize on their long-term investment by trading their property to the highest bidder in order to ensure that at a minimum they avoid a significant tax liability at the exit of their original investment due to depreciation recapture and unknown variables of long-term capital gains taxing rates. In sum, there are market and non-market forces eating away at the efficient delivery or maintenance of all housing types at this time, and it simply doesn't create a healthy housing market with different spectrums of affordability. Third, the diverse toolkit of housing initiatives that we would recommend to be implemented by the state with the help of other counties and municipalities to create a healthy and viable housing alternative would consist of three things. The state needs to invest in more heavily in the creation of funding of housing assistance payments contracts, project-based vouchers, and assistance for the maintenance and creation of public housing and those authorities. These systems need to be elevated in order to ensure that housing is considered a right. The state should also implement a program that rewards naturally occurring affordable housing providers to, rather than trade out of their project for the highest dollar when they would like to exit, have a qualified contract option similar to those that exist in Section 42 transactions that creates an appealing financial environment for those owners to trade their developments to a local nonprofit or public housing authority that would allow the transacting owner to achieve an adequate return on their investment and nullifying their tax obligations at the end of that investment, because it truly is the reason for their trade out. Third, the state should further enhance its ability to curtail and even roll back rent control initiatives that harm the production of all housing types. We understand that there is probably a time and a place for nuanced rent stabilization initiatives, and it is most likely now, as the housing market fundamentals of ownership versus renting continue to change across the housing landscape of the United States and the state of Minnesota, and there remain predatory actors with consumers at the whim of little protections. However, allowing even the ability for a referendum vote to bypass known governmental procedures and expertise in these areas is ill-advised. To that extent, we support the proposed modifications to St. Paul's rent control regulations as proposed by Mayor Carter's administration, and believe that any rent control initiatives or stabilization policies should be crafted to allow for the unfettered creation and exclusion of regulations for new housing being created, provide for a significant grace period in implementing any future affordability caps, and allow for a mark-to-market opportunity when vacancy arises. That concludes my testimony at this time, and I'll stand for any questions or comments. Thank you, Mr. Chair and committee members, for the opportunity to address these crucial housing issues before you today.
Thank you. Vanessa, do you have a quick question?
Well, it's a question, and there was a lot in there, and I was trying to take notes. And so I don't know if you would be willing to share your written testimony so that, and then, Mr. Chair, I don't know if it would be best to follow up with you, and maybe we could get him to follow up with some questions. Specifically, I had questions on like the exit planning. And then you mentioned qualified control options like Section 42 for when people selling NOAA properties. I think that could be interesting. Yes.
I guarantee you we'll have another hearing on this afternoon.
Oh, yeah.
So if
Yeah, I didn't want answers now, but I think
Yeah, so
going forward, yep.
That'd be wonderful if you could.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, Senator, I'm happy to share my written testimony.
I really appreciate that, and I appreciate your time. Members, we have a lot of people that do. Mark Mason is up next, and if you could keep your remarks to the 3-minute-ish would be wonderful. And then after him, we have Jason George up.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, thank you very much for having me here. I will do my best to keep it to 3 minutes. My name is Mark Mason. I am a realtor with RE/MAX for about 10 years, and I'm the owner of Mason Company, investment and development company locally here in the Twin Cities for about 10 years as well. In addition to that, I'm the current sitting president at the St. Paul Area Association of Realtors. I wanted to give you a brief example of my work history. Starting off, I've remodeled well over 100, close to 150 houses in the Twin City area, buying blighted properties, selling them to owner occupants. I've owned quite a few rental properties. I own a construction and a development company. We've done land development, we've built townhomes and houses, etc. Recently, and by recently I mean the last 2 years, we've started buying multifamily properties. We bought 3 properties near here, one in Rochester, one in South St. Paul, and one a little further away in Des Moines, Iowa. All of these properties were very blighted properties. They were run down, they were owned by what many of you might classify as a slumlord. We bought these properties with the intent and have completed renovating them, unit by unit, brick by brick, roofs, parking lots, sidewalks, you name it. We've put millions of dollars into these properties. And we're by no means a large property management company. I would consider ourselves a small to medium-sized investment or development company. These properties are not Class A properties. They're just blighted properties that were eyesores for the communities that they were in. Now that we've owned them, they're amazing properties. Our tenants love us, the police love us, the neighbors love us. People have gone out of their way to contact us as owners and thank us for the work we've done around all of these properties. We were looking in St. Paul and Minneapolis up to the pass of rent control, rent stabilization. Due to the unknowns and the potential impacts, we're no longer looking. I think the guy before me mentioned redlining the area. Essentially, that's us as well. And the negative effect of that is, we're just one small company with a few $1 million looking to invest and make communities better. And we've pulled out of the area. And we're one of many doing that. So I think the loss to the community is tens of millions of dollars of investment dollars that could make these blighted properties, bring them back to their former glory, if you will. The other thing that I would like to point out is none of our properties are at or above market rents. They're at or below market rents. And I tell all of our management team, it is not difficult to buy properties, keep them maintained, and give people a quality place to live. That's what we do. But we can't do that because a lot of these blighted properties are renting for such a diminished amount because they frankly need a massive overhaul. We're not doing it anymore. We can't do it in St. Paul without a clear understanding or a repeal of this past rental stabilization. And it's, and I'll cut it off here short. I've got a few other points, but I just think it's hurting the city more than it's helping because you're losing a lot of investment dollars. So thank you, Mr. Chair and members. If you have any questions about anything, I'd love to answer them.
I appreciate it. Thank you. Next up, we have Jason George and Adam Dunnick.
Mr. Chair, thank you for allowing me this opportunity. My name is Jason George. I'm the business manager and elected leader of the Operating Engineers, Local 49. We're the state's largest construction union. I'm also a St. Paul resident, and with a long family tree on both sides of my family roots in the west side of St. Paul. I'm very proud of that. Disappointed to be here today in opposition of my mayor, who some of you I've worked with a lot and have great respect for, but we part ways on this issue. I want to talk a little bit about, and I also wanted to thank you, Mr. Chair, for drawing attention to what I believe is the disaster of rent control and having this discussion. It's very important. I want to talk briefly about how we got here, the experience in St. Paul. Proponents of this measure and others talk about the community chose rent control, the community supports current rent control. Just to give you an idea of how it got on the ballot, 5,600 people out of 310,000 signed a petition. That to me does not seem like a mandate. In the last election, we had 34% voter turnout. That to me does not seem like a mandate. The campaign was very much, hey, you want to pay less rent? Vote for this. As somebody who worked opposing this measure, it was very difficult to cut through that with facts. I can tell you that. With respect to Mr. Mayor, he supported this measure. And it's easy to blame the community for voting for it, but he was absolutely on record in favor of it, and that made a difference. So what's happened since is important as well, and one word describes it: chaos in my community. It's March 3rd. The policy takes effect May 1st, and as you heard, we have no answers on how this is going to be implemented. Even simple definitions of what rent is or how you appeal this. Nobody knows anything about any of that. The city council has been mentioned. They've asked questions about this for months with no answers on that. So that is very frustrating. Proponents have said that this is all scare tactics by developers, greedy landowners and, others who are just trying to scare people. That is not the case. These things were brought up during the election before this was implemented, and everything that was said is happening now. One example, Luther Seminary, hardly greedy capitalists, I would think, had a project of affordable housing canceled. Their stated reason on their website: rent control. This is mom and pops, newspaper articles weekly about issues they're having. Proponents acknowledge in their own press conference that they've heard from 60 people that have had rent increase similar to the person that emailed you, Mr. Chair. There's no denying that this is a disaster. So you know, where do we go from here? You know, as somebody who not only is born and raised in St. Paul, my entire family, and currently lives there, I was raised in apartments by a single mother. Nobody understands the tensions of check-to-check apartment living better than me. I lived it. So the sentiment here I respect and I understand, trying to help those people. I am that person. I was that kid. So I get it. But the policy of rent control, as you've pointed out, Mr. Chair, this has been tried for decades. It's an absolute failure. There's no doubt about it. What I don't appreciate is the proponents of this pretending that isn't the case. There's many things that can be done, as the gentleman before me just indicated, other things that we can do to help this situation. What we've done in St. Paul is create less affordable housing, higher rent, and created chaos for our community. So I really thank you for this hearing. I look forward to the solutions that you're gonna bring forward. I encourage you all to look at doing whatever you can do to make sure this doesn't happen to another community. St. Paul was conned, and I hope that you all can prevent any future community from being treated the same way. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Now, real quick before you head out, if you don't mind, do you get notified on projects that are canceled or delayed or put on hold? I know you guys work all over and have a lot of members, but are the bids less for housing now that rent control passed in November?
We're aware of, I don't know exactly how many projects that have been canceled or put on hold. We're not aware of how many, just like as the gentleman said, people that just were thinking about investing here that just aren't going to anymore. It's significant, and it'll significantly cost jobs, and it'll significantly impact the city's tax base, and it will significantly hinder our ability to create those 11,000 units that the mayor articulated, and he's right, that we need. There's no doubt about it. We're aware of dozens of projects that have been canceled or paused.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Adam Dudek. I'm the Director of Government Affairs for the North Central States Regional Council of Carpenters, and I just want to echo a lot of what Jason just talked about on the record. I couldn't exaggerate more some of his commentary, some of his thoughts, and his reaction to this issue in front of us. And I also want to say thank you today for the hearing you're conducting and talk a little bit about where the Carpenters Union fits in with this issue. So, you know, I represent 12,000 carpenters around the state of Minnesota, and particularly in the housing industry. It's been a huge growth area for us over the last decade or so. Not that long ago, we only had 300 or 400 carpenters in our union that built multifamily housing around the Twin Cities and throughout the state in regions like Rochester and Duluth. Now we have over 1,600 carpenters doing that. I can't go to a union meeting without meeting a young apprentice who came into the union because they're working on these types of projects. And so this issue is really important to us when it came about last year. And we decided we had to get involved in the public discussion. So I want to talk a little bit about where we believe the real answer to housing issues are, which all has to do and is driven by the need for more supply. We heard that from the mayor. We see that all the time. I was previously the chair of the Metropolitan Council. The council last year talked about how we needed 45,000 additional units over the last decade. We produced less than 12,000. We are not doing the job that we need to do to produce the housing that we have to keep it affordable. And when we enact policies like rent stabilization, rent control, however you want to describe it, you completely inhibit the ability to create that supply. So that's what we want to talk about here at this committee and at the legislature, or what are some things we can do to help build more projects. That's first and foremost. And then secondly, I just want to say rent control serves as a deterrent to building and creating that supply that's needed. When there are questions about how the policy is enacted and put into place, that is exactly some of the challenges that we raised during the campaign. This is exactly the challenges that we've raised with community community groups, we need to be at the table working on these issues as they're being implemented, not finding out after the fact whether it's going to happen, how it's going to be implemented, what the city's going to do to enforce the policy and that sort of thing. And then lastly, I just want to share, you asked about specific questions about projects. We hear about them every week. Myself, other people on our staff, we talk to developers and end users who are thinking about building projects. Either they were far along in the process, like one of the previous testifiers gave. I was actually sitting in the office of a developer in Minneapolis the day after the election, and he said to me, quote, "I thought Minneapolis turned out great council election results. We defeated some of the charter amendments we were concerned about. The rent control one passed, but that just gave the city council an opportunity to discuss the issue. Didn't put a policy into place. We could still formulate it. But then the financial institution that was going to back my project called me and said, we're not going to do the project in Minneapolis." And I said, well, I don't understand. Look at these results. And he said, it doesn't matter. You've gone down the road of looking at rent control. St. Paul already passed it. It looks like you might do something in Minneapolis. So the details don't matter to us. We're essentially writing a red X through your region right now because capital is very mobile. It can go anywhere else. It can go to Omaha. It can go to Madison. It can go to Chicago. It can go to West Coast or East Coast. And that's exactly what our developers, partners have heard, and that's exactly what our fear is, and it's going to impact jobs for our members. So that's what I'm here to talk about today. I'm happy to continue the discussion in the future, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Thanks for being here. And we'll have another hearing. Cecil is up next. And members, we're going to try to wrap it up here in the next 10 minutes, so if you could just hang on. We have Cecil, and then we have real quick, 3 other quick presenters, and then we can wrap it up. So Cecil, please state your name for the record.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, my name is Cecil Smith. I'm the President and CEO of the Minnesota Multi-Housing Association, and I'll be brief. Thank you for the discussion today on rent control. With only one city adopting a rent control ordinance by initiative and referendum, we can see immediately the chaos it's created. Advocates for rent control policy chose to create the most restrictive rent control policy in the United States, and has been disastrous for our housing market. This policy has taken Minnesota off the national map for investment. We're seeing that, we're experiencing that, you're hearing the testimony to that. This lack of investment, when the population of St. Paul is growing faster than the new housing units available, is problematic and will worsen the housing crisis in our state. Policymakers should see what is happening in St. Paul and recognize that this is not a constructive way to alleviate our housing crisis. Stopping or pausing housing development is detrimental to St. Paul and the entire state. While the legislature has made serious investments in affordable housing, those investments are small when compared to the investments by the private market. Minnesota should be looking for opportunities to increase investment in housing. But bad policy, such as rent control, drives investment to other states. A rent control policy can be implemented in communities around Minnesota with relatively low threshold, as was the case in St. Paul. For instance, in the city of Rochester, a city of over 120,000 people, a ballot initiative to put this before the voters can be made with just 3,100 signatures. In Bloomington, a city of 89,000 people, a ballot initiative can be made with just 1,600 signatures. And this just isn't an issue for the larger cities. Small cities like Red Wing could see a ballot initiative pushed in their community with less than 550 signatures. The requirements to get on the ballot are different between cities, but most are not significant, and most are not a significant barrier. In St. Paul, about 10% of the population voted in favor of rent control and completely destabilized an entire housing market. I hope the legislature will support a proposal to reverse the bad policy decisions that happened last year and look to housing solutions that invest in Minnesota's most needy and build more housing for Minnesota's workforce. And lastly, let me point you to the Advocate magazine that was placed for each of the members. This is the MHA magazine, and our latest issue was entirely about rent control, with voices from around the country and particularly rent-controlled cities like San Francisco and Washington, D.C. And we leave that for your reading. Thank you.
Thank you. Up next, we have Deborah, followed by Vivian, and then Laura, and then we're done. So if we could just stick to about a minute for the last three presenters.
Thank you.
Please state your name for the record.
Chairman Dearman, members of the committee, my name is Deborah Housey, and I am a PCA and executive board member at the union at SEIU Healthcare Minnesota. I also rent a house in St. Paul for the last 2 years. Last year, SEIU members endorsed the rent stabilization ballot question in both Minneapolis and St. Paul. We did so because almost all our members said they struggled with high costs of housing. Since the ballot questions were approved, we have been working to make sure they are implemented in the way that works. Recently, St. Paul Mayor Carter appointed SEIU Healthcare Minnesota Executive Vice President Philip Kine to co-chair a stakeholder working group that would advise the city on the rollout that improvement of the rent stabilization ordinance. Rent control is important to me because my rent in St. Paul is going up faster than my pay. I am a PCA. I work 5 days a week and make $14.60 an hour. At 40 hours a week, that comes to $584 a week. 2 years ago, I rented a house in St. Paul for $14.50 a month. A year ago, my landlord raised the rent $50 a month to $1,500 a month. That was a 3.44 increase. This would have been just over the 3% gap in the current St. Paul ordinance. This year, the increase is twice as big. My landlord is raising my rent $100 a month to $1,600. That is a 6.67 increase, well over the St. Paul gap of 3%. When you make $14.60 an hour, there's just is not room in your budget for your rent to go up more than 10% in just 2 years. A 3% cap on the rent increases would help me better afford rent. Workers like me need stability of a capped increase on our single biggest expense. And the St. Paul ordinance had been in place, I would be able to save maybe $50 a month. That may not sound like a lot of money to you, but for a PCA who make $14.60 an hour, that can be a half day of work. For me, $50 a month can be the difference between being able to afford to work and not being able to put gas in my tank. I work 5 days a week for a client in Columbia Heights, and I must drive there back and forth every day. The price of gas keeps going up. Sometimes I cannot afford to put the gas in my car to make it to my client. When gas goes up $50 a month, that is a tank of gas. I must decide if I can pay for my rent or pay for gas. If I don't pay my rent, I can become homeless. If I don't buy gas, I can't earn the wages I need to pay rent, and my client suffers. The legislature has done a lot to invest in the PCAs over the last few years, but all your good work can be torn down by just one big rent increase. That is why I need St. Paul's rent control ordinance.
Thank you for your testimony, and thank you for your work as a PCA.
Sure.
We need more of you. Next up, we have Vivian, and I think you're coming from us online.
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yep, please state your name, and please try to keep it to about a minute. We're 15 minutes over our time, so.
Yes, I understand. And the other testifiers were able to take longer than 3 minutes. So I will do the best I can to be at 1, knowing that other people took longer than was
Yeah,
told.
I apologize for that. We got a late start with committee, and I think you did also submit a written statement that is in all of our packets, so all of our members did receive that.
Wonderful, excellent. So hello, my name is Vivian E. Hekronya. I am a lead organizer at Isaiah, and I'm a St. Paul resident. Minnesotans across race, income, and ward deserve to have predictable housing costs, whether they're a homeowner or renter, given that homeowners have predictable housing costs and renters do not. In my hometown of St. Paul, something had to be done to stop predatory practices and egregious rent spikes from happening, especially in a city where the majority of residents are renters. In my city, where a predatory landlord repeatedly intimidated me and my family for 5 years with rent hikes. Fortunately, St. Paul voters were not intimidated by the opportunity to consider limiting rent increases, so all St. Paulites could have predictable housing costs. And the Keep St. Paul Home campaign contacted over 50,000 voters in St. Paul and collected over 10,000 signatures. So I do want to correct the misinformation earlier about the number of signatures collected. It was over 10,000. So 53% of St. Paul voters who voted last fall voted in favor of this policy, despite over $4 million spent by the corporate landlord lobby and special interests to pose a false choice between housing equity and housing supply, and to distract us from having a robust conversation about the growing trend of displacement and housing instability that demanded a real look at rent stabilization. St. Paul's current efforts this spring to figure out how to implement an effective and sustainable rent stabilization policy involves constructive and intentional conversation with different community stakeholders at the table. This table includes people like renters who have had less power compared to the well-funded and politically connected corporate landlord lobby. This is what real democracy can and should look like if we're serious about addressing our housing challenges together. This is why the conversations this committee started last year about furthering preempting rent stabilization at the local level are deeply troubling. Preemption would obstruct the will of thousands of voters in St. Paul and Minneapolis, and moreover, it would rob cities of having rent stabilization as one of many tools in the toolbox for addressing our housing crisis. It would rob cities of being able to learn from the use of this policy and sharing these learnings across cities. Instead of using preemption to suppress the power of voters and allow the corporate landlord lobby and special interests to have unchecked power, let's adopt a spirit of learning and good faith problem solving so all Minnesotans can have a home they can count on. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Next up, I think we have Laura, and
Yes.
you're it. So thank you for being here. Please state your name for the record.
Hello, my name is Laura Delventhal, and I am a resident of St. Paul. My husband and I have rented within our apartment building since 2011. Our 2 beautiful children were born in St. Paul. St. Paul is our home, where we have built a life and a family. We love our diverse community and welcoming neighborhood. Our apartment building is part of an affordable housing program. So the maximum rent my landlord is allowed to charge is based on a percentage of average rent in my neighborhood. But because our neighborhood has been inundated with luxury builds in the last several years, my ostensibly affordable rent has been allowed to be raised by 22% in just 3.5 years. When you pair that with rising childcare costs, my family paid over $27,000 in childcare last year alone. It's not sustainable. Families cannot afford to remain in their homes. Just last month, our neighbors across the hall, a family of color with 2 children just a bit older than ours, had no choice but to move out of our building. It is clear that more affordable housing without rent stabilization is not enough. Capping rental increases by a predictable, reasonable 3% per year is progress that my family and thousands of others are counting on. Rent stabilization is a life-saving measure. Because of the statewide law, we had no choice but to pursue a city ordinance to cap rent hikes, so we did. Organizations like Housing Equity Now St. Paul, Isaiah, SEIU, and others informed over 55,000 St. Paulites about this policy and did the hard work about getting out the vote, even with $4 million against us. St. Paul voted and the people spoke. And I urge this committee to cease conversation, to subvert the will of the people and allow the structural change that me and my neighbors, black, brown, and white, fought hard to pass to keep St. Paul home for all of us for years to come. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Members, I apologize for running late. We had a late start with the hearings or the floor session. But thank you for being patient and sticking it out. We will bring this up here in the coming weeks again with a bill proposal. So we are adjourned for the day. Thank you.